heut Morgen übers Feld, danach auf den Gräsern hing, sprach zu mir der lustge Fink, ei du Geld. Guten Morgen, ei Geld, du willst nicht eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt. Zink, zink, schön und flink, wie mir doch die Welt gefällt. Auch die Glockenblumen fällt, hat mir lustig gute Ding, mit den Glöckchen klinge, kling, klinge, kling. Ihren Morgengruß geschellt, will's nicht eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt? Kling, 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 schön und kling, wie mir doch die Welt gefällt. Heia! Und da fing im Sonnenschein gleich die Welt zu funkeln an. Alles, alles Ton und Farbe gewann im Sonnenschein, und Vogel groß und klein. Guten Tag, guten Tag, ist's nicht eine schöne Welt, ei du Geld, ei du Geld, schöne Welt. Nun fängt auch mein Glück wohl an. Nun fängt auch mein Glück wohl an. Nein, nein, was ich meint, nimmer, nimmer drehen kann.
I'm here with Kenneth Woods and delighted to welcome you to the Music Room, Ken. Now, we have a history of working together with the English Symphony Orchestra, and that's something I've been missing greatly over the last few months. But there are exciting plans in the pipeline, and I wonder if you could share some of them.
Yes, it's going to be such a relief to make music with colleagues again. I mean, I think one thing everyone says, what are the casualties of COVID-19? And certainly one of the casualties is going to be cynicism. That I think a lot of our habitual music industry hard-boiled cynicism has been shown up for what it is, which is a facade a lot of us wear to protect ourselves emotionally in a difficult industry, because all of us are missing it desperately. So we're going to be working in the studio for the next several months in projects that are a combination of making recordings for CD and streaming, with filming performances of the works that can be web streamed as audience-free concerts. And that means, that one concert could be 10 minutes long, another could be an hour long. Some that might be several pieces and several composers. Others might just be very immersive or selective. The format can be totally flexible. And for the listener, they don't have to decide, is it worth 25 quid to decide whether I do or don't want to hear this piece by a composer that I don't know. And we don't have to slot the projects into an existing framework of a subscription series. So what I'm hoping is that the kinds of programs that we like to do and want to do will have more opportunity to sort of cross-fertilize here. And that, you know, people who maybe normally wouldn't come to a sit-down evening classical concert might be more tempted to give a Tchaikovsky piece that's, say, 40 minutes a try, while on the other hand, our adult grown-up audience might actually engage with a storytelling work which was originally written for kids. And you know, if we get to the end of whatever this is going to be, this period of disruption and lockdown, having moved some of our audience around a little bit and pollinated some of these different kinds of musical experiences with our listeners, then, you know, some real good will have come out of this, hopefully. A big part of ESO's reason for being, if you like, is to expand the repertoire. And that includes commissioning and premiering new works, but it also includes bringing into the repertoire lesser known works. Now, that might be a work of a well-known composer that is not often played. So you and I last year did the Schumann Violin Concerto, which is still quite a rarity compared to Schumann's other music, but it's a wonderful piece. And we were, I think, able to make a really strong case for it. And there's lots of pieces like that in the outputs of the composers in the canon. That might also include pieces by composers who are in some ways not far removed from the canon, but whose music fell by the wayside of history for one reason or another. There's a whole generation of composers of the generation after Mahler and Strauss and Elgar, whose professional lives were disrupted, and sometimes, in some cases, their actual physical lives were ended during World War II and the time before and after it, particularly the Jewish composers of Central Europe, but not just those. And this is some of the richest and most interesting and audience-friendly music that there is, and music that we want to have heard. There's also a chance to expand the repertoire through arrangements and orchestrations and taking a piece that is a chamber work and turning it into an orchestral work, or taking a big orchestral piece and reducing it for smaller forces. In the last couple of years, we've made recordings of two iconic chamber works. We did Donald Fraser's orchestration of the Elgar Piano Quintet, which you and I played together in Bristol a couple of years ago. And then we recorded my arrangement of the Brahms A Major Piano Quartet. And those pieces give us an opportunity to broaden our interaction with composers that are really important to us. There's only 4 Brahms symphonies. There's only 2 Elgar symphonies, well, sort of 2.5. There's the third symphony that Anthony Payne assembled. But suddenly you have symphonic works that can take the place in the season of a Brahms symphony and offer something fresh to the audience. And I think to composers and new music advocates who say, well, you know, do we really need a new piece of Brahms? I think anything that encourages the audience to get into the habit of trying something new benefits everyone in the ecosystem. You know, try this, you may like it. You must know the children's story, Green Eggs and Ham.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, I feel like my job, in addition to, you know, down, in, out, up, is really to be Sam I Am. You know, and, you know, try it. You may see. Try, and I'll conduct in 3. But you can only do that if you're convinced that both the eggs and the ham are delicious and that the audience will like it.
And how about the combination of new and old? I think you said something very interesting about arranging and bringing music to by composers we all know and love, but to audiences through a new filter, so through a new format. And that's part of a very long tradition of people arranging music so that it can be heard. I can think of all those arrangements of symphonies for 1 or 2 pianos, so people could play in their music rooms and experience that for themselves. I think there's a long and proud tradition of that. How do you feel ESO's place in that tradition? How do you feel that in terms of arranging and also commissioning new music? Because the ESO's 21st Century Symphony project seems to me to fit very well alongside this idea of arranging.
Well, these are really interesting questions, and I'll confess that you've made a connection that I haven't made in the past between the 21st Century Symphony project and arranging. One of the projects we're going to do in the studio this summer is a program called A Child's Journey. And this is a collection of pieces by several different composers which explore the idea of a child's journey through life through the prism of music. And so we're going to start with Wagner's Siegfried, which was written to celebrate the birth of his son. It's a celebration of the beginning of life and that moment of expectancy and joy and uncertainty. And then we're going to look at all of these wonderful expressions of the uncertainties of childhood, which show up in all sorts of folk tales. So, for instance, we'll do a short excerpt from Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel, which is the scene where they're lost in the forest at night and the little Sandman comes to put them to sleep and they sing an evening prayer. For me, this is, 5 minutes of the most beautiful music ever written. And this sense of wonder and apprehension and of course, these fairy tales are not meant to be read as literal things. We don't send our children out into the forest to get eaten by witches. It's the sense of how does a child deal with progressing into the unknown of life. We're going to do a song by Mahler called The Earthly Life. And it's a very, very dark and spooky song in which a child is saying, "Mother, I'm starving, I need food." And she says, "Well, I've just got to plant the wheat in the field and then we'll have food." And the child says again, I'm hungry. She says, "Well, I'm making the bread, just be patient." And of course, at the end of the song, she says, "Okay, the bread's ready, here's dinner." And the child is starved in the meantime and died. It's incredibly morose in a way. But again, it's both for the parent, the idea of how do you deal with the horror of not being able to protect your child? And I mean, all of us are thinking about that now as we think about whether to send our kids back to school and what the new world is going to mean for them economically, socially, educationally, never mind the immediate threats to health of them, their grandparents, their parents. How long is this going to go on for?
Warte nur, mein liebes Kind, morgen wollen wir backen geschwind. Und als das Brot gebacken war, lag das Kind auf der Toten.
We're going to do Schubert's Die Forelle, the trout, which is, one of his most charming little songs about a young girl who's watching a fish in the river, and she sees that the fisherman is, of course, tricking the fish into biting the hook. And this intersection of, wanting food, but being shocked at what it takes to get it. And then we go back again into this idea of the forest with Wagner's Forest Murmurs from his opera Siegfried. And then the last two things are Death and the Maiden, again, of Schubert. And then the last thing we're going to do is Das himmlische Leben, which is the last movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony. And it's a companion piece to the earthly life, which tells of a child in heaven surrounded by food and joy and, freed of the cares of the earthly life. And all of these are arranged for the same forces, which is a string quintet, a couple of woodwind players, piano, harmonium, and percussion. The idea being like a little salon orchestra of solo players. And what happens with that is none of these pieces were written for that combination of instruments, and it takes all of the music into its own little world and connects all the languages of these different composers in a single sound world. So hopefully from the birth of the child in the Siegfried Idyll through to the heavenly life at the end, this whole life story of a child. And when Mahler's writing about a child in heaven, he means that we reclaim our childhood in heaven, I think. That we are all the child in heaven, even if we live to be 85. That journey can all be expressed as a sort of unified thing. I think one of the highlights of my professional life was a concert you and I did together in Bristol, which was the second concert in the 21st Century Symphony project when we premiered David Matthews' Ninth Symphony. We were going to do the Elgar Cello Concerto on that program with Sheku Kana-Mason. And this was about 2 weeks before the royal wedding, which meant at this point, Sheku was one of the most famous people in the world. He was in every newspaper, in every magazine. David Matthews' Ninth Symphony and Donald Fraser's orchestration of the Elgar Piano Quintet, in that order. And I was really worried about doing those pieces in that order because I'm not, totally delusional. I realize these people are there to see Sheku, not to see Ken conduct contemporary music. First of all, are they all going to leave after the Elgar? Well, of course, Sheku brought the house down with the Elgar. And even before he played a note, it was an electric atmosphere. But then, after he left, no one else left. We played the Matthews, and the audience went just as bananas.
I do think it's becoming more and more polarizing in new music. The sort of hardcore new music, which is extremely experimental, often very hard to digest for the players. I speak from personal experience, and certainly for the audience, it requires a lot of explanation. It requires maybe even two hearings in the same concert so that people can come to grips with it. And usually all sorts of effects and special techniques, extended techniques, and then what you're talking about really, especially with David's music, which is tuneful contemporary music, classical music. And I think for quite a long time it was really unfashionable and frowned upon to write a tune if you're a contemporary composer, which is fine. I think people needed to go that far, didn't they? The boundaries need to be pushed all the time, but it's quite important to remember, really, for everyone, audiences, players, everyone alike, that it's just as valid, isn't it, to write beauty and melodiousness in your music, and to write for standard forces in a standard way. It's still completely valid.
It is valid, and it's there's still lots of new things to be done. It's important to remember that this originated as a reaction to World War II, and the great German conductor and composer Michael Gielen just died a couple of years ago, and he said in an interview fairly late in his life that he just felt, having grown up through the war years and seen what that did in Germany and what Germany did to the world, that he just couldn't imagine how you could morally justify writing a happy piece of music after that. Writing a tune, writing a beautiful melody seemed obscene after that. And I totally get that instinct that we have to look at everything about our humanity in the wake of a historic cataclysm like that, and not just go back to business as normal. And I think it's perfectly fine to say that hardcore contemporary music and the symphonic tradition are essentially different art forms now, both wonderful in their own right, but that it's not necessarily always going to be beneficial to the music to try and mix them all the time. One of the other projects we're going to be filming this summer is a program of storytelling pieces, which is really close to my heart. You'll remember you and I doing some of these works earlier this year. I mean, what did you make of that crazy experience?
It's one of my highlights of all time. I loved it. Not only because I got to hear you doing brilliant New York accents and stuff like that. It was fantastic. And I always thought it would be good fun, but it turned into something far bigger and better than that for me. And the music itself is so witty and brilliant fun to play. But I think the thing that lifted it really completely into another zone for me was the audience's response to what we were doing, and the feeling of I think you only really get it with someone telling a story. There's a particular relationship that forms between the storyteller and the listeners, and the way it unfolds with music is then even more special.
There are things like The Emperor's New Clothes, which are very direct and funny and traditional sort of, I mean, these are iconic children's stories told with a lot of humor and playfulness, to things that are much more esoteric and strange, like the Levinson fables that we did, which I think that's a musical masterpiece. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible music and amazing stories and amazing poetry.
This story is called The Princess and the Man with a Pure Heart. It comes from a very old book of stories from India called the Mahabharata. People still tell these stories in many countries, including India, Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia. One thing these ancient civilizations have in common is that they all use magic.
But hopefully all of these will be pieces that, appeal to everyone from, 6 to 86, as they say, and show that the genre isn't just Peter and the Wolf, or isn't just cutesy bootsy, that it can be laugh out loud funny, that it can be tears streaming down your cheek sad, it can be everything in between. And I'm excited to do this one.
Yeah, likewise. I think what you said about the function of storytelling to help people understand, and frankly, as I'm reading them to my daughter now, not just children but adults as well, to give that context and the allegory of it, somehow I find it simultaneously reassuring now reading those fairy tales, but also it really makes me think afresh. Out of all of this comes the fact that actually you're not only a conductor but also a cellist. Would you tell us a bit about your life as a performing cellist as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's funny for me because I think the seed of conducting probably preceded the seed of cello playing, which is completely backwards and wrong and horrible. But I was lucky. I went to a little program called the Preschool for the Arts in my town growing up. And our teacher, who was a wonderful woman named Barbara Goy, took me and a couple of her other young kids to watch a rehearsal of the local youth orchestra. And they were rehearsing Shostakovich 5. And I was maybe just barely 4, but I was so excited by the music and so amazed by the relationship between the conductor, who was a man named Marvin Rabin, who kind of founded the modern youth orchestra movement in America. His involvement with the orchestra immediately fascinated me as a little kid. And after that experience, I mean, first of all, I stood up and started trying to conduct in the rehearsal, and the whole orchestra fell apart laughing, as they would with a cute little kid. They probably thought I was making fun of Marvin, but I was just trying to figure out what he was doing. But of course, after that, I went back to my parents' house and, made them play Shostakovich 5 on the record player all day, every day. I didn't come from a family of musicians. Both my parents are musical, but not musicians. So I started through the public school music program. And when they came around to the 3rd grade classes and said, next year in 4th grade, you can pick a string instrument and play it, I said, I want to play the double bass. And and he laughed at me. He said, you can't play the double bass. You're much too short. And so I said, I want to play the double bass. It's the coolest instrument in the orchestra. And so he said, well, look, why don't you start on the cello? And then when you're tall enough, you can switch to the double bass. But by the time I'd been playing the cello a couple of years and gotten a little bit taller, I realized the cello parts were way more fun than the bass parts. And that schlepping a cello around was bad enough. God knows I didn't want to have to deal with something twice the size. My dad's a chemistry professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's taught there since 1967, and he's still teaching there now in the same office. He's got the same phone number. I mean, how many people in our generation will have the same office phone number for 52 years, 53 years? It's just amazing. And he loves, in particular, all kinds of American folk and bluegrass and roots music. He was a pretty darn good guitar player when I was a little kid, and when I was about 6 or 7, he got his first banjo. So we had, floating around the house, all the great folk vocal guitar banjo groups of the 60s, people like the Limelighters and the Kingston Trio. And I loved that music, absolutely loved it. And he was big into Dixieland music too. That was all around all the time. And I eventually got a guitar of my own when I was about 7. It was a nylon string classical guitar. And then, of course, at some point you realize that there was one thing he wasn't telling me about, which was rock and roll, and that was the ultimate can of worms. So the next thing you know, I'm buying my first electric guitar, playing in rock bands, immersing myself in the world of jazz and the blues and rock and roll, and playing guitar behind my head. And all through my university years, I was, on the one hand, trying to get my act together as a cellist, but on the other hand, playing 2, 3, 4 nights a week in clubs, and it was great fun. I really miss it, and I think it's really healthy for conductors to play an instrument, even badly. I mean, every year I kind of say maybe it's time to stop doing it in front of other people, because you don't want to embarrass yourself, and there's so many demands on your time, and I often end up not playing the cello at all for weeks in a row if I'm busy conducting and traveling. It's not an instrument you take with you in the same way that you take a flute with you. You have to buy a seat for it. So, most times it just, means you leave the cello at home and see it when you see it. On the other hand, everything a conductor does has to be negotiated, not in a legalistic sense, but in a sort of time sense between you and the musicians. And sometimes in life, the musicians play really well and you don't conduct so well, and you get something that's better than you deserve. And sometimes you conduct your heart out, and horn players crack notes, and maybe the players just are young or inexperienced or whatever. It's not a direct relationship between how well you've done your job and how well it comes across to the audience. On the other hand, if I'm sitting down at the piano and I intend to play an A and I put my finger on the wrong key, that's a direct result. And same with playing the cello. It's as in tune as I play it, and the sound is as nice as I make it, and that's very grounding. It takes away a lot of that sort of head fog that conductors all suffer from, and it both humbles you and encourages you. And I think that's been really important for me over the years. And what seems to have happened is, every few years I think, okay, well, it's time to give up on the cello, and then there'll be just some new project like the string trio that I played in for most of the last 10 years. I didn't see that coming at all, but having spent a lot of the 1990s playing in a piano trio and a string quartet, it was a repertoire I didn't know. It had been a long time since I'd been in an ongoing group. And it became this wonderful counterbalance to what I do as a conductor. Because, as a conductor, you do a piece once and then you go on to the next project. As a string trio, you play the same Beethoven trios over and over and over and over again. And you can go so much deeper into the music, and you learn a lot from that. And it changes your relationship with music when you have those touchstone pieces that you've lived with and done a gazillion times. I'm curious, have you ever been tempted to conduct?
Oh, directing from the violin is as far as I've been tempted. No, I actually, I admire conductors more and more. I think when I started out in orchestras, I had the usual kind of ignorance and arrogance of youth and thought that, it really, what was a conductor without an orchestra anyway, and it really was all down to us musicians playing. And more and more I've come to realize what exactly conductors really do, and that's put me off more and more, if I'm perfectly honest. Just because I don't, it's not something I feel any inclination towards, just as I have always, I think maybe it's the thing of hiding behind the violin a bit. I've always felt most comfortable with a violin in my hands, and I think that's not likely to change. I'll let you know. I'll be asking for lessons if it does.
I think some of my happiest experiences in the last 5 years or so have been chamber music with colleagues in my orchestras. Think of that Bruckner Quintet we did at Mahlerfest last year with members of the Mahlerfest Orchestra, and then repeating it back here. I mean, those are just priceless experiences on a purely musical level, but when you add in that chance to actually get off the podium and sit down in a semicircle with your friends and colleagues, and, set aside all the bullshit, for lack of a better word, and just focus on music. It's really wonderful. And so I hope it's something we can keep going in my life for several more years. It's certainly been a really good thing thus far. Yeah.
Well, Ken, you just mentioned Mahlerfest in that last comment. If you'd like to just tell us a little bit about that, would be great. And also maybe some of the other orchestras you work with regularly, and maybe how that's all come about. And I think this role of artistic director, what that actually means, that would be wonderful.
That's a good question. I think artistic director means you have to take out the trash and set up the chairs in a way. For me, it's got a job tailor-made for me, because I like to write. I like the process of programming. I do both chamber music and conducting. So to be able to program a festival and think about how you put Mahler in context, it's gone from being championing Mahler to using Mahler as a well-established and well-up composer to champion other composers, to bring new music to the fore, to bring back music of the generation of Jewish and Central European composers after Mahler. So last year when you were there, we did the Korngold Violin Concerto. Korngold knew Mahler as a young boy. He met when Korngold was 9. His dad was the music critic at the Vienna newspaper. And Korngold's Violin Concerto, which was written after World War II, is dedicated to Alma Mahler, Mahler's former wife. So, there's all these connections to be mined where Mahler gives a point of entry for music lovers into composers who are less known that maybe they would really love. And that's been fantastic for me, because it lets me do the sorts of things that I really love to do in addition to conducting. So for someone who's, a blogger and a talker, it's been fun.
Now that blog that you've just mentioned,
Yeah.
called A View from the Podium, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that, because it's one of the most widely read classical blogs on the internet, as I understand, which is no mean feat, Ken.
The blog was started in, I think, 2006. At the time, I think it really was the first blog, a professional conductor, that lasted more than 2 or 3 posts. I think it's up a couple thousand by now. And of course, over the years, I found it incredibly empowering, and a way in which I could make good use of all the different kinds of experiences I would have.
But it's unusual in that you are definitely the kind of musician who delves very deep into the history of music and the history of the composer, the history of the performance of that piece as well. And I think that's a really amazing hinterland for anyone who's interested to read it, to understand that you're not just bringing experience as a player and as a conductor of this music, but also the background context of a piece. And with this personal slant, I think it gives it a very unusual and completely unique and also refreshing perspective and insight. It's like reading the best kind of program note, because it feels entirely relevant and not just learned and regurgitated. And I think that's a real, a very uncommon and a very big strength to bring to your music making, is the ability to write it down like that.
Music is one of the few things, in arts in general, in which we are empowered to connect directly to wonderful things without much mediation. Anyone can look at a great painting, anyone can hear a great piece of music, and have their own relationship formed with this work of art. And in a world that's full of walls and stratas and barriers and gatekeepers, that's actually something really empowering. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that actually, as a performer, there's a point in your life where you reach a sort of freedom of realizing that you can have that same relationship with a piece of music that's direct in the same way that you do as a listener. And I think it means that you feel like the connection is much more immediate, and you realize actually, this is not great music for serious thinkers. It's human experience that we can all relate to. That these people were much more talented than us, but they are otherwise dealing with the same stuff we all are. So why not put it on your blog and just say, I love this chord. Here's why.
It's that dreadful word, well, it's a great word really, but it's been so misused. It's accessible. And I think that it, in the truest sense of the word, writing about music in the way that you do and speaking about it in the way that you do, because you also address the audience in our concerts in a uniquely engaging way.
Accessibility and authenticity are kind of, for me, the same thing. And so I never speak with notes when I give pre-concert talks or speak from the podium. And partly that's because I'm disorganized and lazy. But I think more to the point is that it means that as I speak, I'm watching their faces and seeing how they're reacting and what they're engaging with. And you can easily see, oh, they like this thread. So I'll pursue this aspect of the piece as I talk to them a little bit longer. You can't do that if you're reading from notes, but also it means for them as listeners, I'm not just regurgitating something dead off the page because they need to know this to listen to the music, but that they're hearing my thoughts, and it is not without risk. I've of course had the excitement of doing one of those and having the audience in stitches and having it create a really great atmosphere for the concert. You think, I'm the best in the world at this. And then the next week it falls completely flat and you can't remember what you wanted to say. You can't find the right words. And you think, oh God, I should really write this stuff down. We can make music speak both to the sort of human experience as it's always been, that Shakespeare still speaks to us now, but that actually it's relevant to our own times and what our audience members are going through now. And when I did, when we did the Sawyer's Third Symphony in London, a listener came to me afterwards and said, that was amazing. It was the first time I thought in 30 years of going to concerts, this must be what it was like to be at the premiere of Shostakovich 5, because I finally felt like there was a piece without words that doesn't say what it's about, but that somehow captures the uncertainty and the intensity of this sort of historical moment where we're all worried about the direction of the world and what's going to happen. That shouldn't be something that we think happens by accident, but that, as we develop our organizations, we actually try to create those moments. And who can we ask for a piece that will say something that helps people make sense of their own experience?
Do you think that, you said a bit earlier about the cataclysm of the Second World War and the essential kind of split that started in music after that, of new music expressing the difficulties and the dark side of humanity. Do you think what's going to come out of our current situation, obviously without wanting to be an oracle, but do you think, do you have a feeling of where new music is going to go?
It's a really interesting question. I look back to the years before World War II, and what makes me pessimistic about now is that the interwar years between the two world wars were one of the greatest golden ages of the arts in human history. And not just in terms of producing a whole mountain of masterpieces and breakthroughs in every genre, but that also the line between art and entertainment blurred for the better. And so you look in commercial fields of entertainment in the 20s and 30s, in popular music and in film, and you see so much work of staggering creativity and originality and interest. And what terrifies me now is that the opposite has been happening for a long time, which is that the commercial paradigm of the entertainment industry is being adopted in the arts world. So rather than making our public entertainment more uplifting, more creative, more inspired, more human, more empowering, we're making our high art, as it were, more like McDonald's, more like Disney. On the other hand, what makes me optimistic is that, in this day and age, a group like the ESO, which has absolutely no money, we don't even have a concert hall of our own, we can get works like the ones that we've had written for us the last few years, written that do everything the greatest music of all time does. There are fantastic talents out there, and this is definitely a golden age for the symphony as a genre. There's more great performers than ever. Everything is possible at this moment, and I think we do have a younger generation who've come up and seen what the rot of society does to people in the long term. What's great about ESO is that, we've got our own musicians running youth projects that are changing the lives of kids all the time. We're all involved in making the future for ourselves, and that actually all it really takes is not, being an important person, but just the passion to, do what you can. And that's what it's going to take, because it could all end very, very badly. There's, I don't know what's going to happen.
I think what you've just said about people integrating music into communities and from childhood up, and orchestras doing that in a very active manner is going to be one of the ways to save music. And ESO is something that makes me very proud to be a member of an organisation that does exactly that, and I think just about all of its core membership take part in education work or work in care homes, just as important. Really very quiet community and truly local and applicable and important things. And I think that's something that's very, very much going to be part of what shapes the future of certainly of music. You say we're all human beings, Ken, but you do have so many things constantly on the go. So one thing that strikes me is that you must have superhuman time management, or a couple of extra hours in the day that other people don't have. So can you just give us a bit of insight into how you keep all of these plates spinning?
I'm sure Suzanne would absolutely howl with laughter at the idea that I have great time management skills. I'll make a confession for the record. There's no point in lying about these things. I think rather than being, you have to be one of two things. You have to be either really, really structured or able to sort of turn it up a gear when you have to. And I'm definitely in the latter category. I think you have to kind of accept at some point that, you know, we're not all meant to be role models of organization or structure, and you know, hopefully find life partners who can put up with that.
If you could put together a list of any people you would have at your best ever dinner party, from your favorite composers to anyone, who would you ask?
Living and or dead?
Yes, anyone.
Okay. Oh gosh, this is a good one. Definitely Schumann. Definitely. And Clara too. You know, just to be in her presence. You know, she's someone you still, you know, just astounded by what she achieved professionally, and an incredibly gorgeous lady too. So we'll have the Schumanns to dinner. I always thought Dvorak would be a great person to hang out with. You know, again, he seems like a regular guy, and someone whose life was really interesting, and much more of a sort of family person than most composers. Could I invite Jimi Hendrix? Yeah, I think. I mean, you know, he's my all-time rock and roll hero, and you know, he loved Mahler. He wrote about how much he loved Mahler's music. We could talk about that a little bit. He lived in Handel's apartment for a little while. Yeah, and I think he would be a good one to have around. And then maybe someone who can kind of stir the pot. You know, someone with a really sharp wit. Maggie Hambling would be great for that.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and share fascinating insights and lovely anecdotes. It's been an absolute treat.
Oh, it's been a blast. Thank you so much for asking, Zoe. And thanks to everyone else out there for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it.